Okay then gang, so we've seen quite a lot of the basic HTML tags now, and for the most part when you create a website, about 80 or 90% of the stuff that you write in HTML is going to be a combination of those tags you've already learned. So I guess you could say you're 80 or 90% of the way there to becoming a front-end developer. Probably not, but you know what I mean. You've learned a lot of the basic tags now, but I want to move on to another important part of HTML and creating websites, and that is HTML web forms. So we use web forms to capture user information, and that user information could be for different things. For example, we could want to log a user into the website, and for that we'd have a login form, and that login form would capture the user's login credentials, their email and password or something like that, and then log them in. We could also have a contact form which captures a name, a message and a contact number or something like that, and then sends a message to the admin of the site. Or we could have a sign up form or a feedback form. I'm on Airbnb right now and they've got a form to search for properties. So when we have web forms, they're typically made up of a series of different input fields, and they're input fields because a user inputs information to them. So this right here, this is an input field. These are input fields because the user is entering information into them. So I could type something in here, and down here I could, select date. It's a different type of input field because this is for a date and this is for text, but they're still input fields, and they are what forms are made up of, different input fields. So if I just inspect this right now by right clicking and going to inspect, I'm going to have to open up a few of these div tags because this goes quite deep, I think. Eventually we'll get there, and now we can see this input tag right here. So this is for a user input field, and you can see that the type of tag, that's an attribute type, is text, meaning we want to capture some text from the user. So like I said, there's loads of different types of input fields, and we're going to take a look at quite a lot of them in this video. Okay then, so I've completely stripped out all of the content from the last couple of videos, and I'm left with this bare bones HTML file called index.html. We have the doc type, then the HTML tag, then a head, and inside the header title, HTML forms, and then a body, which is all of the viewable content inside the browser, then just an H1 saying HTML forms. So what I'm going to do is actually right click and open with live server so I can view this inside a browser. Awesome. Okay, so the first thing we need to do when we're creating a web form is to create a form tag. So if I just type form and then tab, it's going to create this tag for me. But you're going to notice this action attribute right here. Now this action attribute right here tells the browser what to do when we submit the form, but that kind of behavior is beyond the scope of this tutorial for now. That's more to do with PHP and server-side data. So for now, what we're going to do is just concentrate on creating forms in HTML. So we have our form tag. We don't need this action attribute. And inside this form tag, that is where we put all of our input fields. Okay then, so let's try adding a few simple input fields. So to do that, we need our input tags. I'm just going to say input, then tab, and that's going to create our input tag for us. So notice it doesn't have a closing tag. It's a single tag. And we have this type attribute automatically applied for us by VS Code, and that is set to text. So this type attribute describes the type of input field that it is, or rather the type of data we expect of a user. So when we say type is equal to text, it means we want some kind of arbitrary text value from a user. Now that could be a username, it could be a search term or a country or something like that. So this describes a simple text input field. I'm going to save it and just preview over here in the browser, and we can see this input field right here, and we can type stuff into it. So then another attribute I'm going to show you is the ID attribute, and the ID attribute is a bit like an identifier for this individual tag. So the value over here must be unique, and no other element on this page can have the same ID. So if this was username, for example, then no other element on this page can have the ID of username. And by the way, they're not limited to just input fields IDs. We could add an ID to any tag like the H1 if we wanted to, ID of title or something like that. I'm not going to do that for now because I don't want to complicate things, but I'm just letting you know we can add this ID to any tag we want to. So what is an ID for? Well, it serves a few different purposes. First of all, it identifies that individual tag, right? Secondly, we could use it in CSS as a hook so that we could style this later on. However, it's not really widely used in CSS for this, and we use other things instead, but we can use it. And also we can use IDs in JavaScript as well as hooks in case we wanted to reach in to the HTML and add some interactivity with this field. We could use JavaScript to come in and get this ID, okay? So there's several use cases for this ID. Another one is that we can link it up with a specific label. So say, for example, I want to add a label above this input field to say what a user should do, because right now, if I'm looking at this, I don't know whether to type my favorite food in here or whether to type my name or what. So we normally add some kind of label to tell the user what to type in that input field. So I'm going to create a label tag, press tab, and notice we have this for attribute. So it's asking us here, look, what input field is this label for? Well, we're making this label for this input field right here. So what we do is we say it's for this username, the ID of that input field. And what this does is then link this label with this input field. So we could add in the content of the label right here, something like enter username, colon. And now if I save it, we see this over here. And notice if I click on the input field, then it goes into focus and we can start typing. But also because now we have associated this label with this input field using this for an ID, now also when I click on the label itself, because of that connection, it comes into focus as well and I can start typing. Okay, so if you want to associate a label with an input field, use an ID and also this for attribute on the label. Okay, so there's our first label and input field pair. So let's have a look at some different input types. This one is type text, but there are several different types. So next, I'm going to do a label first of all, and this is going to be for an input field, which will give an ID of email. And then we'll say enter email right here. Underneath, we want an input tag, and the type this time is going to be email because we want that type of data from the user, an email address. So we're telling the browser now, look, we want an email address inside this input field. And that does a couple of things. The browser interprets this input field as an email input field. And so if we were viewing this on a mobile phone, when we clicked into this input field, it would show us a different keypad at the bottom with the @ symbol on it. And also what it does is it allows some simple front-end validation performed by the browser. We don't have to do anything to check that this is a valid email as well when a user enters into it. So the type is email. It's going to look the same as this, but the behavior in the background is slightly different. So we also need to give this an ID equal to email so that the label right here can be associated with this input field as well. Save that. And notice it doesn't look any different, but again, behind the scenes, it will be a bit different, and we'll see an example of that shortly. Okay, so there's two input fields. What I'm actually going to do is just place a BR tag right here, or two of them, so we go down a couple of lines between each input field. So let me save that and preview, and now we can see these on different lines. Okay, so let's do another couple of BR tags right here, BR, and then we'll do a third label. This time it's going to be for a password. So that will be the ID of our third input field. We'll say password right here. And also the input field. This time it will have a type of password. Again, on first glance, it's going to look the same as text and email, but behind the scenes, it's going to behave differently. I'll show you that in a second. But also it's going to have an ID of password so that the label and the input field are linked together. So then let me save this now and come over here. Looks the same, but check this out. If I start to type something in, now we don't see the letters, and that's good because if we're choosing a password in a public place, we don't want other people to see what we're typing. So by us telling the browser that the type of this input field is password, we're saying hide what the user types into this field. It's a specific type of data we want. Now, before we go any further and add more input fields and different types, I just want to talk about another attribute that we can add to these different input fields, and that is the name attribute. So the name attribute is a bit like the ID attribute right here in that it identifies that particular input field, but it also has another purpose. The name field can be used for server-side processing. So a PHP file on the server could use the name field to get the value from that particular input field. Now, all of that is beyond the scope of this whole tutorial series. And if you do want to learn more about that, I do have a whole PHP tutorial series for beginners on this channel. So once this series is over, feel free to go and check that out if you want to learn more about server-side processing. But it is always a good idea and good practice to add on a name field as well, just to identify these fields a little bit more, so that if a PHP or backend developer comes in and needs these, they have those values right there. So I'm going to give this one a name of username, and pretty much I always give the ID and the name the same value most of the time anyway. So I'll give this one a name of email, and finally I'm going to give this one a name right here of password. Now, the reason I wanted to also talk about names is that they have as well another important role in HTML forms, and that is to group different parts of forms together. Now, an example of this is when we use radio buttons. Okay then, so here's a little example of some radio buttons in action. So in the browser, they look something like this. We have several different options and we can select only one of those options. So for example, gender, male, female, or other. So we can't select multiple, and if we select one, it unchecked whichever was selected before it. Now in the code, it looks something like this. We have 3 input fields, one for each option, and each one has a type of radio, which is why they look like this. Now they all also have a name attribute and they're all set to gender. They're the same. And that makes sense because we're selecting a gender in each case. But this groups all of these radio buttons together. And that's what makes it so that we can only select one of them at a time. If we check one of them, it goes through the other input fields with this name attribute to gender and it unchecks those. So if this was something else, gender 2 for example, run, then we could select this because it has a name of gender 2 and this one. So it doesn't force us now to switch between the two because these are no longer related and they don't have the same name. But the top two still have the same name attribute, gender, so we can only select one of those. So that's why this name attribute is so important when it comes to grouping different input fields together, especially in the case of radio buttons. Now notice also that we have this value attribute right here, and that is so if we were to submit this form, then the server could see which value is submitted. Now previously when we've been using input fields, the user has entered the value directly, they've typed that in themselves, but now they're not doing that, now they're just selecting one of these options. So we have to provide the value to that option ourselves, and that's what this is, so that the server can read this value and see what we've selected. So let's give this a go and try it out in our own code. Alright then, so let's try adding a few radio buttons. First of all, what I'm going to do is a p tag just above to say select your age. Now this is not a label I'm doing here, just a p tag, because a label is associated with a particular input field. Now this is not associated with any one particular radio button, just a little bit of text before them. So now let's do our radio buttons. So we need an input. The type is not going to be text, it's going to be radio. Now remember, we need a name attribute right here, and this is going to be called age. So all of these radio buttons are all going to have this name attribute called age to group them all together. Now remember, we also need that value property because this is then going to be used if a server-side developer takes this form and wants to get the data from it. So we'll set this to 0 to 25, and then I'll also give this an ID, and we'll just call this option-1. Doesn't really matter what you call it, it just has to be unique. So now I'm going to do a label for this input field right here. Now I'm doing it below the actual input field, so it comes after it rather than before. So this is a label for option 1 right here. That's why we gave it an ID. So option 1, and inside it's going to be this value, 0 to 25. So that's our first radio button, and if we save this now and check it out over here, we can see this radio button right here. So we need a few more, and instead of writing them out from scratch, I'm going to copy this and paste it down below. The type is still radio, the name is still age, The value this time is going to be 26 to 50, and then this will be option 2. So we need to change the label for attribute to option 2, and then this is 26 to 50. So remember, this is just a label at the end of the day. This data doesn't mean anything. It's just so the user can see what they're selecting. This is the actual value which would be processed server side later on when a user submits the form. So let's do one more. I'm going to paste this down here one more time. Again, an input type of radio. The name is age because we're grouping all of these together. The value is going to be 51 plus, and then this is option 3. And then option 3 down here, and we just need to say 51 plus down here as well. So if we save this now, then check this out in the browser. We can see these 3 options, and we can try and select one. If we select another, then it deselects the other one. Okay, so we can only now select one of these options. So that's what grouping all of these things together with the name attribute does. Now, in this series, we're not going to be looking much at the value property, or the value attribute rather, right here, and server-side processing of data. Because I think to cover all that in one series, especially to a new developer, is going to be off-putting and daunting. But I do want to make sure that you understand why I'm putting these attributes in, these value attributes. Because with understanding comes a better memory of things. If you know why something's there, then you'll tend to remember to put it in. So, I mean, we're not going to use these value attributes ever. It's just there because then if you pass this code to a server-side developer, they can grab the values with something like a PHP script or something else from these things right here. So the next type of form field I'd like to talk about is the select box, also known as a drop down, and it looks something like this thing right here. So a user can click on this and select a value, and then that becomes the value of that drop down or that select box. Now in this case it changes the content down here, but on a normal form it might not do that. It just then takes on the value of whatever the user selects, and then when we submit it we can send that value to the server to do something. So we're going to take a look at how to create these now. And by the way, I suppose these are a little bit like radio buttons in functionality because we're selecting one of many values and we can only select one value. But in this case, it just looks a bit neater because it doesn't take up as much room. So let me now go to the HTML and let's try to create one of these. First of all, I'm going to do a couple of BR tags to go down a couple of lines and give us a bit of space. Then, first of all, I'd like to create a label. We'll come back to the for attribute in a minute, and then we'll say something like security question. So, you know, like on websites when you sign up and they ask you a load of stupid questions, that's what we're going to create right here. So, first of all, we need the actual drop-down box. Now, this is known as a select tag, and it's one of the few cases in forms where we're not actually using an input like we have done before. And that's because inside a select tag, we have to nest different options. So first of all, let's give this select tag a name. I'm going to call it question, since this is going to be a list of questions that we can choose, a list of security questions. And we'll also give the ID question as well. So this label right here, this is going to be for question. So inside a select tag right here, we have different options, and they're the different values that we want to show to a user like these. So each option is inside its own option tag like this, and each option is going to have a value. Much like we had a value for each radio button, we also have one for each option, because then we're saying when a user selects this option, this is the value of the form field. So let's put a value of Q1 for the first one. And inside, we'll just say something like, what color, let's spell it correctly. What color are your favorite pair of socks? And I missed a U there. Okay, and that's the first option. So if I save this now and come to the browser, then we're going to see this. Security question, what color are your favorite pair of socks? Now let's add in a couple more options. So again, option. This time the value will be Q2. And then inside here, we'll say something like, if you could be a vegetable, what would it be? And then we'll do a third option. And this will be Q3 for the value. And we'll say, what is your best ever security question? Okay, so basically, if a user now goes to the form and it selects one of these, then if it selects this one, the value of that field will then become Q2, and that would be what is sent to the server if we submit the form. Likewise, it would be Q1 if they selected this, and Q3 if they selected this. So let's save this and give this a whirl. Save and check this out. And we can see right here, we can select any one of these things. Now, normally when you select a question, you need a form field to put in an answer as well. So for that, I think just a normal text field will do. So what I'll do is just add that in as well. We'll do another couple of BR tags to go to the next line down. And then I'm going to say label at the top. We'll come back to the for attribute. We'll say security question answer. So this is where they're going to answer the question. And then down here, we can say input, and that's going to be of type text. We need an ID, and that's going to be equal to answer. And also a name attribute, which will also be equal to answer like so. So this can now be equal to this ID to associate the two, answer like that. Okay, so let's save that. And now we can see we can answer right here. So select one of these, and we can say down here, whatever the answer is, okay? So that is select fields. So there's one more form field I want to show you, and that is the text area. So these are typically for things like comments or biographies or anything that is going to require quite a lot of text and where something like a normal text input field is not enough. So they're more like a box. Now then, I'm going to create first of all 2 BR tags to give us some room and then create this text area. Now, like the select right here, the text area is not actually an input. That's just the way that HTML has evolved over the years. So for this, we use a text area tag. Now this comes along with a few different attributes. The first one is going to be the name, which I'm going to set to be bio for biography. The ID will be the same, but then we also have calls and rows, and this determines how far across and how tall this text area is going to be. So the higher this number, the more columns it's going to have, and the further it's going to go across. And the more rows it has, the more rows going down it will have, therefore the deeper it will be. So if I save this as is and preview in the browser, then I can see a box this big right here. So that's kind of like the default value. Now you can override these values right here, the width and height essentially, using CSS, but we'll talk about CSS probably starting in the next video. We'll leave that for now. So notice this has an opening tag and a closing tag, and inside what we could do is some default content. So I could say something like enter your bio ... and save it, and you're going to notice that that now automatically appears in here. Now I don't want default content at the minute because we're going to do this another way later on. So let me just delete that for now. I do need a label for this field, so we'll say label. And that is going to be for bio because that is the ID right here. And inside the label, I'll just say your bio like so. Okay then, so if I save it and preview, we can see it looks something like this. Now I'd like this to be above the box. So what I'll do is use a BR tag right there so that we go into a new line and it looks something like this. Now notice with a text area, we can grab this little thing in the corner and move it around like that so it becomes different sizes. So that's another feature of a text area. So if someone's typing something in and they want a bit more space, they can actually create that space themselves. Okay, so that's nice. Now then, I said there was another way that we can add default content essentially to this field, and that is actually using what's known as a placeholder attribute. So let me write this out, then we'll see what it looks like. Placeholder, and this is going to be equal to about you ... Okay, so if I save this now and preview over here, we see that default content, but if I click here and start typing, it disappears. Okay, so it's only there when there's nothing inside the field. So that's nice. That's what a placeholder does. It gives you a little hint as to what to type, but you don't have to actually delete this. It's not real text, and as soon as you start typing, it disappears. So that's what a placeholder is. And we can add these placeholders to different things, different input fields. So for example, I could come right to the top to the username, the email, and the password, and if I wanted to, I could have a placeholder on each one of these input fields. So let me do that. What I'm going to do is click here. I'm also going to press Alt and click here and here as well. So now our cursor is in all three places. We can do this in VS Code. Then space, and I'm going to type placeholder and set it equal to something. So now the top one over here, I'm going to set equal to username. And then this one I'll set equal to your email. And then this one at the bottom, I'll say choose a password and save it. So if I preview now and go to the top up here, now we can see these placeholders. And again, if I was to start writing, then they disappear. Okay? So that's nice. That's what we use placeholders for. And sometimes if we have placeholders, then we don't always need the label. I tend to keep the label in because I think it's just a bit of extra information. And you can't always be too convinced that users are going to understand your web forms. So I always put it in two different places. We have placeholders and labels, but that's just me personally. You could do something else if you wanted to just use this or just use this. So then, my friends, there's one last thing I'd like to show you, and that is the submit button. So the submit button is something that a user clicks to submit the form when they've filled it in. So to do this, we say input, and the type this time is going to be submit. So let's change that to submit. We also need a value property on this, and that is going to be the value that actually shows inside the button, so the text that a user sees. So we'll just set this to submit the form, and that's all we need to do. So now if we save this and preview, then we should see this button right at the bottom. We need a BR tag, I think, right here, so that it goes down a couple of rows. Save that and preview again, and that looks better. So then, what happens when you submit a form? Well, normally when you submit, the browser takes the value inside the action attribute inside the form, and that will be a reference to some kind of backend script maybe, or something like that, and then it will send all the data that a user types in to that script. Now, we don't have any action attribute because we're not concerned with backend development or data processing at the minute. But if I just save this and we start to type in some data, just any old junk like this, and then we press submit, what happens also is the page refreshes, but you should also see, and by the way, we need to just change this. This is a bit of validation I was going to show you in a second, but we'll just add it in for now. I'm going to submit the form, and now you see all of this stuff up here. So this is all of the data that we entered, and that can get sent to the server for some processing. Or JavaScript could also take over and do something with that data as well. Now, if you want to learn more about JavaScript or PHP or data processing, I do have a full PHP course on this YouTube channel, check that out later, and also a modern JavaScript course as well. So both of those you could go on to after this course. But for now, we're just concerned with actually showing this form on a web page. Now, the next thing I was going to move on to was a bit of validation that we just saw about the email, because HTML5 comes with some built-in validation. So if I was to submit the form, it would check our data and make sure everything is correct. So for example, we know that this input field right here is an email, right? So if I type something in here that isn't really a valid email and try to submit, then we're going to get this feedback from the browser. That's a nice addition to the HTML5 specification. So now we have to add in that @ symbol, okay? So now that would allow me to submit the form. Okay, now we could also mark certain form fields as required. Notice we left these empty before and it still worked. If I click on submit the form, it still works. Now, if we want something to be required, i.e. we need a user to type something in, then all we have to do is add on the required attribute, like so. So required, and then required, and again, we don't need to set a value. It defaults to true, and then required for this one. We'll save that. Now, if I try to submit it, then it's going to come up with an error saying, please fill in this form. And it won't submit this form until we fill the things in. I'll try and submit again. It goes to the next one. Please fill this in. And again, we see we need an @ symbol. So that's nice. And then a password. If I try to submit first of all, I have to fill that in. And then finally, because none of the rest are required, if I submit, it works and we see all that data up here. Okay? So there we have a basic web form with probably most of the common input fields that you'll use. There are other types of input fields we can use for different types of data, and there's a big extensive list on W3 Schools. So I'm going to leave this link down below in the description so you can go and check these out and play around with them. But you can see them all right here. So we have things like color, date, file, hidden, etc. And they've all got their own purpose. And it's going to show you an example of most of them as well down here. And there's some interactive little games you can play, or exercises rather, to try it out yourself. But anyway, now you should be in a decent position to make some basic forms yourselves, things like a contact form or something similar. Alright then gang, so we've learnt quite a lot in this video, probably enough to make your brain melt, but do not worry if you don't remember all of it. Like I said before, Google is your best friend on the web. If you forget something, just Google it, and there's going to be loads of resources, especially for HTML forms out there on the web, but hopefully now you understand kind of the logic behind web forms. So we've seen how to create a web form, and we know now what the action attribute on that form tag is for. Even though we've not used it ourselves, we kind of understand why it's there. It's to do with server-side processing of the form data. We've also seen a lot of the most common input types inside forms, things like a text field, email, password, radio, select, and a text area. So with those different fields, you could go out and make a form that would make up probably about 75% of the forms out there on the web. We've also seen how to use labels, the ID attribute to link an input field with a label, and also we've talked about the importance of the name attribute in form fields as well, especially when it comes to grouping those input buttons together. Finally, we've seen how forms are submitted and validated by the browser before the data is sent off to a server. So now we've learned quite a lot of essential HTML over the last few videos, and what I'd like to do now is shift our focus for a while to CSS, because CSS is going to start to help us create better looking websites. So at the minute when we create HTML and we view it in a browser, it's all looking a bit crappy, for want of a better word. So CSS is going to come in and it's going to help us to make things look less crappy, and in some cases even good. So from the next video onwards, we're going to bring CSS into the equation to start to make these web pages look a little better.